The morning sun beat down on Officer Brennan's patrol car as he cruised through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge. It was only 11 a.m., but sweat already soaked through his uniform. His radio had been buzzing nonstop since his shift began at dawn. "Another day in paradise," he muttered, taking a swig from his lukewarm coffee. The day had started badly and only gotten worse. First, he'd responded to a domestic disturbance call where a husband and wife screamed at each other while their children watched with frightened eyes. Then came another similar call across town. By mid-morning, he'd spent an hour dealing with a fender bender where both drivers refused to admit fault, pointing fingers and demanding justice for dents that could barely be seen. Brennan rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. 20 years on the force, and days like this made him question why he'd ever pinned on the badge. His radio crackled. "Any units available for a welfare check on Oak Street?" Brennan reached for the radio, but stopped when something caught his eye. A black sedan with tinted windows rolled through a stop sign up ahead. Under normal circumstances, he might have let it slide with just a warning. But something about the sleek car in this upscale neighborhood touched a nerve. This was exactly the kind of vehicle residents had been complaining about lately, suspicious cars that didn't belong in the area. The neighborhood association president had cornered him just last week at the coffee shop, asking why the police weren't doing more to protect their community. Without hesitation, Brennan flipped on his lights and hit the siren briefly. The sedan pulled over immediately, which surprised him. Usually, these types took their sweet time, acting like they owned the road. "Dispatch, I'm conducting a traffic stop at Maple and Pine," he said into his radio, giving the plate number as he pulled up behind the sedan. Brennan sat for a moment, watching the driver through his rearview mirror. Standard procedure: make them wait, establish control. The driver didn't move, hands visible on the steering wheel. Good, at least they knew that much. As Brennan approached the vehicle, the tinted window rolled down smoothly. Inside sat a black man in his 50s, dressed in what looked like an expensive suit. The man's calm expression and perfect posture made Brennan feel disheveled in comparison. "Problem, officer?" the man asked. His voice was deep and steady, with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of being in charge. Something about the man's tone, was that amusement, made Brennan's skin prickle with irritation. Here he was, having the day from hell, and this guy acts like being pulled over is just a minor inconvenience in his important day. "License and registration," Brennan demanded, skipping his usual greeting. The lack of courtesy was deliberate. "Let the guy know who's in charge here." The driver nodded and reached slowly toward the glove compartment. "Today would be nice," Brennan added, his patience wearing thinner by the second. The man's hand paused mid-air. He turned to look directly at Brennan, his expression unreadable. "Officer, I'm just retrieving my documents as requested." The measured response only irritated Brennan more. Was this guy trying to make him look bad? Teaching him how to do his job? The driver handed over a leather wallet and a neatly folded registration from the glove compartment. Brennan snatched them without a word, noticing the man's perfectly manicured nails and gold watch that probably cost more than his monthly salary. As Brennan flipped open the wallet to check the license, the man cleared his throat. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Brennan looked up from the ID, his eyes narrowing. The headache that had been threatening all morning was now pounding behind his eyes. One more person questioning his authority today was one too many. Little did Brennan know that his next actions would change the course of his career forever. The man's ID was still in his hand, but he hadn't really looked at it yet. If he had, he might have noticed the name, the title, and saved himself from what was about to unfold on this sweltering summer day in Pine Ridge. Brennan stared at the license in his hand, not really seeing it. His mind was too busy brewing with irritation. The leather wallet felt expensive, real leather, not the cheap stuff. Everything about this man screamed money and privilege. "You rolled through that stop sign back there," Brennan finally said, gesturing vaguely behind him. "This neighborhood has strict traffic laws." The driver nodded slightly. "I apologize if I didn't come to a complete stop. I certainly thought I did." There it was again, that calm, measured tone that felt like nails on a chalkboard to Brennan's frayed nerves. No fear, no nervousness, not even the usual anxious respect most people showed when pulled over. Just cool confidence. "You thought wrong," Brennan snapped. He glanced at the license again, still not processing the name or details. Instead, he was noticing the address from the wealthy part of the neighboring district. Of course. Do you know how many accidents happen because people like you think stop signs are just suggestions? Brennan continued, his voice rising slightly. Kids live in this neighborhood. The driver remained unnervingly calm. I understand your concern for safety, officer. That's something we can both agree is important. We? Brennan almost laughed. Let me tell you something about we. We don't all get to drive fancy cars through nice neighborhoods ignoring traffic laws. A flicker of something, disappointment, maybe, crossed the driver's face. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. If you just... There's no misunderstanding, Brennan cut him off. I saw what I saw. The man tried again. If you look at me. Step out of the vehicle, Brennan ordered suddenly, his patience gone. He didn't want to hear whatever excuse this guy was about to offer. The driver blinked, genuine surprise finally breaking through his composed exterior. Excuse me. You heard me. Step out of the vehicle. Brennan's hand moved to rest on his belt, not quite touching his holster, but close enough to make the implication clear. For a long moment, the driver didn't move. He looked at Brennan, then down at the license still in the officer's hand, then back to Brennan's face. Is this really necessary? He asked quietly. I decide what's necessary, Brennan replied. Now step out, or things get complicated. With deliberate slowness, the driver unbuckled his seatbelt. The door opened, and he emerged from the car with the fluid grace of someone used to making an entrance. Standing at his full height, he was taller than Brennan had expected, with broad shoulders under his tailored suit jacket. Hands where I can see them, Brennan said, even though the man's hands were already visible at his sides. The driver complied, raising his hands slightly. Officer, I think you should know. Turn around and face the vehicle, Brennan interrupted again. This is completely unnecessary, the driver said, his composure finally showing cracks of frustration. If you would just look at my identification. I don't need your ID to tell me you think you're above the law, Brennan shot back, stepping closer until they were just inches apart. I see guys like you all the time, thinking your money means you don't have to follow the rules the rest of us live by. The driver squared his shoulders, drawing himself up to his full height. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, deeper, with an unmistakable note of authority. Officer Brennan, he said, reading the name tag on Brennan's chest, I strongly suggest you take another look at my identification before this goes any further. Something in his tone made Brennan hesitate. For the first time, he'd actually looked down at the license in his hand. The name jumped out at him, followed by the job title printed in official lettering below it. Brennan's stomach dropped. The headache pounding behind his eyes seemed to intensify as realization dawned on him. This wasn't just some rich guy flaunting the rules. This was much, much worse. The man watched recognition spread across Brennan's face and gave a slight nod. Now, the driver said quietly, shall we start this interaction over? Or would you prefer to continue down this path? Brennan stared at the ID in his hand, his face draining of color. The man standing before him wasn't just any driver. He was Police Chief Thomas Wilson from the neighboring district, one of the most respected law enforcement officers in the entire state. The world seemed to slow down around Brennan. The chirping birds, the distant sound of lawnmowers, the occasional car passing by, everything faded as his mind raced to process what was happening. I didn't realize, Brennan stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. Chief Wilson's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. Clearly. Brennan tried to recover, fumbling to hand the ID back. Sir, I apologize for the confusion. If I had known. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Wilson interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority. The fact that you treat anyone this way is concerning. That you'd only change your approach once you realized who I am is even more troubling. Shame and embarrassment washed over Brennan in waves. The headache that had been pounding behind his eyes all morning now seemed to split his skull. What had he done? How could he have missed something so obvious? Sir, it's been a difficult day, Brennan began, knowing how weak the excuse sounded even as he said it. We all have difficult days, officer, Wilson replied. The real test is how we handle ourselves during those days. a test Brennan had failed spectacularly. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. This could end his career. Worse, it could confirm what some of his colleagues had hinted at in break room conversations, that maybe he did have a problem with certain drivers. "I'm going to need your badge number and the name of your supervising officer," Wilson said, pulling out his phone. Panic surged through Brennan. "Sir, please, I don't think that's necessary." His voice had lost all its earlier authority, now reduced to something close to begging. Wilson looked up from his phone, one eyebrow raised. "You don't think accountability is necessary, Officer Brennan?" "That's not what I meant," Brennan backpedaled. This isn't. I'm not." "Not what?" Wilson challenged. "Not normally like this. Not having a good day. Not someone who judges people based on appearances." Each question hit Brennan like a physical blow. He had no answers, at least none that would sound anything but hollow. In that moment of uncomfortable silence, a car drove by slowly, the driver craning their neck to see what was happening. Great, Brennan thought, witnesses. This was going from bad to worse by the second. "Your supervisor's name," Wilson repeated, his phone ready. Brennan swallowed hard. "Lieutenant Rivera," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Wilson typed something into his phone, then put it away. "I know Rivera. Good officer." The implied comparison hung in the air between them. "Look," Brennan tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "I made a mistake. It won't happen again." "That's what concerns me," Wilson said, straightening his tie. "The fact that you think this was a one-time mistake rather than a symptom of a larger problem." Brennan felt his face burning. He wasn't a bad cop. He wasn't racist. He was just doing his job, wasn't he? But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, doubt crept in. Why had he been so quick to escalate this particular stop? Why hadn't he even properly looked at the ID? "I'd like to return to my vehicle now," Wilson said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "I trust that won't be a problem." Brennan nodded mutely, stepping aside. As Wilson moved past him, Brennan caught a glimpse of something shining on the inside of the man's suit jacket, a police chief's badge, gold and gleaming in the sunlight. The sight of it made Brennan's stomach drop even further. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever happened next would likely reshape his entire career and force him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself that he'd been avoiding for far too long. Brennan stood rooted to the spot as Chief Wilson returned to his car. The morning heat felt even more oppressive now, sweat running down his back and soaking his uniform. He watched as Wilson made a phone call, gesturing occasionally while speaking. Brennan didn't need to hear the conversation to know exactly what was happening. His career was unraveling before his eyes. When the chief finally hung up, he stepped back out of his vehicle and approached Brennan with measured steps. "Officer Brennan," Wilson said, his voice steady and professional, "I've just spoken with Lieutenant Rivera." Brennan's mouth went dry. "Yes, sir?" "He's expecting you back at the station immediately. I'll be following you there." This wasn't a request. Brennan nodded, unable to form words. The short walk back to his patrol car felt like a mile. His legs were heavy, his mind racing through potential consequences. Suspension, demotion, termination, or worse. His actions recorded, shared online, becoming another example of everything wrong with policing. The drive back to the station was a blur. In his rearview mirror, Brennan could see the chief's black sedan following at a precise distance. Too close to run, too far to communicate, a perfect metaphor for Brennan's current situation with the truth. The station parking lot was surprisingly empty when they arrived, small mercies at least. Fewer witnesses to his humiliation. As Brennan stepped out of his car, Chief Wilson was already waiting, somehow having parked and exited his vehicle with impossible efficiency. "This way," Wilson said, not bothering to check if Brennan was following. They walked through the station in silence. Officers at their desks looked up as they passed, curious about the unfamiliar face of Chief Wilson, even more curious about the grim expression on Brennan's face. Whispers started immediately. Bad news traveled fast in a police station. Lieutenant Rivera was waiting in his office, standing behind his desk rather than sitting. Never a good sign. He was a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual frown that had only deepened with Wilson's phone call. "Close the door," Rivera said as they entered. Brennan shut it behind him, feeling like he was sealing his own fate. Chief Wilson has informed me of a troubling incident, Rivera began without preamble. Before we proceed, I want to hear your version of events. Brennan took a deep breath. He could lie, minimize what had happened. But what was the point? There was no talking his way out of this one. I conducted a traffic stop, he began, voice steadier than he felt. I observed a black sedan roll through a stop sign. When I approached the vehicle, I was unprofessional. Unprofessional, Wilson repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. Is that what we're calling it? Rivera leaned forward. How exactly were you unprofessional, Brennan? I was short with the driver. I escalated the situation unnecessarily. I ordered him out of the vehicle without proper cause. Brennan swallowed hard. And I failed to properly identify who I was dealing with. And if it had been anyone else? Rivera asked. If it hadn't been Chief Wilson, would we be having this conversation? The question hit Brennan like a punch to the gut because he knew the answer. If it had been anyone else, any regular civilian who didn't have the power and authority of a police chief, he would have continued his aggressive approach, maybe even made an arrest on some trumped-up charge of disrespect or non-compliance. I don't know, Brennan answered honestly, surprising himself. Chief Wilson nodded slightly, the first hint of approval he'd shown since their encounter began. That's the first honest thing you've said today, Wilson noted. Let's start there. Rivera picked up a form from his desk. Brennan recognized it immediately. Administrative leave paperwork. Effective immediately, Rivera said, sliding the form across the desk. Pending a full investigation. Brennan stared at the paper. It wasn't unexpected, but seeing it made everything real. 15 years on the force, and it had come to this. There will be a hearing next week, Rivera continued. I suggest you use this time to think very carefully about your actions and what kind of officer you want to be if you're allowed to wear that badge again. If, the word echoed in Brennan's mind. Not when. If, 3 days into his administrative leave, Brennan's apartment had become a prison. Empty pizza boxes and take-out containers littered the coffee table. The blinds stayed closed, keeping the world and its judgments at bay. His phone buzzed occasionally with messages from concerned co-workers, but he ignored most of them. What was there to say? The department had been unusually quiet about the incident. No press release, no public statement. Brennan wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Maybe they were building a stronger case against him. Maybe Chief Wilson had more pull than he realized. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. Brennan considered ignoring it. He wasn't expecting anyone, and he certainly wasn't in the mood for company, but the knocking continued, more insistent. All right, he grumbled, hauling himself off the couch. He looked through the peephole and froze. Lieutenant Rivera stood in the hallway, in plain clothes but unmistakable with his stocky build and perpetual frown. Brennan opened the door reluctantly. Lieutenant. Officer Brennan, Rivera nodded. May I come in? It wasn't really a question. Brennan stepped aside, suddenly aware of the mess his apartment had become, a physical manifestation of his mental state. Sorry about the... He gestured vaguely at the clutter. Rivera waved it off. I've seen worse. He remained standing, declining the half-hearted gesture Brennan made toward the couch. I'm not here for a social call. I figured as much. Brennan crossed his arms defensively. Is this where you tell me to turn in my badge for good? Rivera studied him for a moment. That depends on you. Chief Wilson has made a rather unusual request. Brennan's stomach tightened. What kind of request? He wants to meet with you. Privately. Of all the things Brennan had expected, this wasn't one of them. Why? He didn't share his reasons with me, Rivera said, though his tone suggested he had his suspicions. But I wouldn't keep him waiting if I were you. Rivera handed him a business card with an address written on the back. It wasn't the police station or any government building Brennan recognized. Tomorrow. 10 a.m., Rivera said, already moving toward the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. And Brennan? Take a shower before you go. After Rivera left, Brennan stood staring at the card for a long time. What could Wilson possibly want? To personally deliver the news of his firing? To humiliate him further? Or was this something else entirely? That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Wilson's face, heard his calm voice asking that devastating question. If it hadn't been Chief Wilson, would we be having this conversation? The truth was uncomfortable. Throughout his career, Brennan had prided himself on being one of the good ones. He'd never used excessive force, never falsified a report. But how many times had he made assumptions based on appearances? How many times had he been short with certain drivers but not others? By morning, Brennan had made his decision. He showered, shaved, and put on civilian clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt, casual but respectful. The address on the card led him to a small coffee shop in a mixed neighborhood on the border between the two police districts. Chief Wilson sat at a corner table, dressed similarly in casual clothes rather than his usual suit or uniform. Without the trappings of authority, he looked different, still commanding, but more approachable somehow. Brennan approached the table, heart pounding. Wilson gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Officer Brennan, thank you for coming." "Did I have a choice?" Brennan asked before he could stop himself. Wilson's mouth curved slightly. "We always have choices." That's rather the point of this conversation. On the table between them sat a manila folder. Wilson placed his hand on it but didn't open it. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Brennan shook his head. "This is your record. 15 years of service. Commendations, complaints, performance reviews. Everything that officially makes you who you are as an officer." Wilson tapped the folder thoughtfully. "But it doesn't tell me what I really need to know." "And what's that?" Brennan asked, his mouth dry. Wilson leaned forward slightly. "Whether you're worth saving." "Whether I'm worth saving," Brennan repeated, the words catching in his throat. The coffee shop hummed with morning activity around them. A barista called out orders. The espresso machine hissed. Normal life continued while Brennan's hung in the balance. "That's right," Chief Wilson said, his eyes never leaving Brennan's face. "I've been doing this job for over 30 years. I've seen good cops go bad cops pretend to be good, and everything in between. What I haven't often seen is a cop truly change." Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "And you think I can?" "I don't know yet. That's why we're here." Wilson pushed a coffee cup toward Brennan. "I took the liberty of ordering for you. Black, no sugar, right?" Brennan blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" "I've done my homework," Wilson said simply. "Just as I know you were top of your class at the academy. Just as I know you've had 6 civilian complaints in 15 years, all dismissed. Just as I know your bodycam has malfunctioned 3 times during traffic stops in the past year alone." Heat crept up Brennan's neck. "Those were technical issues." Wilson said nothing, just raised an eyebrow slightly. "Look," Brennan continued, defensive now, "I know I messed up with you. I was having a bad day and I took it out on you. But that doesn't make me a racist." Wilson finished for him. "Maybe not, but it doesn't make you not one either." The bluntness of the statement hit Brennan like a slap. "I'm not. I don't," he sputtered. "Let me ask you something," Wilson interrupted. "Would you have treated a white man in a suit the same way you treated me?" Brennan wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe it was true, but the hesitation before he could form the word told them both everything they needed to know. Wilson nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Here's what I see, Brennan. I see an officer who's not necessarily bad, but who's been on autopilot for too long. Who's let biases creep in without examining them. Who's forgotten why he put on the badge in the first place." The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. When had Brennan stopped seeing people and started seeing stereotypes? When had the job become about control rather than protection? "The review board meets next week," Wilson continued. "They're looking at your record, at the bodycam footage from our encounter, at your history of traffic stops. The numbers don't look good for you." "What numbers?" Brennan asked, though part of him already knew. "The racial breakdown of drivers you've pulled over. The difference in how those stops were conducted and resolved." Wilson tapped the folder again. "The data tells a story, Officer Brennan, whether you intended it to or not." Brennan stared into his coffee cup, watching the dark surface ripple as his hand trembled slightly. "So that's it, I'm done?" "I didn't say that." Wilson leaned back in his chair. "I actually have a proposition for you." "A proposition?" Instead of a termination, I'm going to recommend a reassignment to my district, under my direct supervision. Brennan's head snapped up. You want me to work for you? After what happened? Because of what happened, Wilson corrected. I'm starting a new community engagement initiative, building bridges between officers and neighborhoods where trust has been broken. I need officers who understand both sides of the problem. And you think I do? I think you're starting to, Wilson said, and that's more than I can say for many. Brennan's mind raced. It wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. Working under Wilson's watchful eye would be intense, possibly humiliating. But it was a chance, more than he probably deserved. Why would you do this? Brennan asked finally. You could have just ended my career. Wilson was quiet for a moment, because firing one officer doesn't fix the system, but transforming one officer might help change it. He leaned forward again. So what's it going to be, Brennan? Take the easy way out, or do the hard work of becoming the officer you claim to be all along? The question hung between them, heavier than the badge Brennan wasn't sure he'd ever wear again. His answer would determine not just his future, but the kind of man he wanted to be. When do I start? Brennan asked quietly. 6 months later, Brennan stood at the back of the community center watching Chief Wilson address the gathered residents. The room was packed, elderly folks, young parents with children, teenagers trying to look unimpressed, but listening all the same. Community policing isn't just a buzzword, Wilson was saying. It's about building real relationships. It's about understanding that the badge doesn't put us above you, it connects us to you. Brennan shifted his weight, uncomfortable in his new uniform. The shoulder patch of Wilson's district still felt foreign, a constant reminder that he wasn't where he expected to be at this point in his career. But then again, nothing about the past 6 months had been expected. The first few weeks had been brutal. Word had spread quickly about why he'd been transferred. Some officers kept their distance, eyeing him with suspicion or contempt. The community was even worse. People recognized him from the viral bodycam footage that had somehow leaked online. Badge Spitter, one kid had called him on his first community patrol. Wilson hadn't made it easy either. He'd partnered Brennan with Officer Lee, a veteran community liaison officer with zero tolerance for the old ways of policing. Lee had dragged Brennan to community meetings, school visits, neighborhood cleanups, places Brennan would have avoided in his previous life. You can't police people you don't know, Lee had told him repeatedly. And they can't trust cops they never see except when something's wrong. Slowly, painfully, the lessons had started to sink in. It wasn't just about avoiding racist behavior, it was about actively building bridges, learning names, remembering faces, following up on concerns not because they were high-priority crimes, but because they mattered to the people who lived there. I'd like to introduce someone who's become an important part of our community outreach team, Wilson said suddenly, gesturing toward the back of the room. Officer Brennan, would you join me up here? A murmur went through the crowd as Brennan made his way to the front. Some faces showed surprise, others skepticism. A few nodded in recognition from encounters over recent months. Many of you know Officer Brennan's story, Wilson continued once Brennan reached his side. It would have been easy to dismiss him, to make him the face of everything wrong with policing. But true change doesn't come from throwing people away. It comes from the hard work of transformation. Brennan scanned the crowd, his throat tight. He hadn't prepared to speak, hadn't expected to be called forward. I think Officer Brennan has something to share with you all, Wilson said, stepping aside from the microphone. The silence was deafening. Brennan stepped forward, his heart pounding. He thought about prepared speeches and official apologies, but in the end, he simply spoke the truth. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what it meant to wear this badge, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I was wrong. I confused authority with respect, control with safety. I judged people based on what they looked like or what car they drove, not who they were. He took a deep breath. I can't undo that. But standing here today, I can tell you that I'm listening now. Really listening. And I'm learning. From Chief Wilson, from Officer Lee, but mostly from all of you. An older woman in the front row nodded slowly. Brennan recognized her from the neighborhood watch, Mrs. Washington, who had initially refused to even speak to him. Now she attended every community meeting, challenging him with tough questions, but also acknowledging when he got things right. This badge doesn't make me better than anyone, Brennan continued. It just gives me a bigger responsibility to be better for everyone. I won't always get it right, but I promise I'll never stop trying. When he finished, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was cautious, measured, just like the trust he was slowly rebuilding. But it was real. And for Brennan, that meant everything. Later, as they helped stack chairs, Wilson clapped him on the shoulder. Not bad for a work in progress. Brennan smiled slightly. That's all any of us are, right? Works in progress. Wilson nodded. The trick is to make sure you're progressing in the right direction. He paused, looking Brennan in the eye. Are you? Brennan thought about the past 6 months, the hardest, most humbling of his career, but also the most meaningful. Yes, sir, he said. I believe I am.